Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with authors and journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. We have another Republican administration, another invasion into a Middle Eastern country on false pretenses, and now the Trump administration seemingly has no plan for what's next. And while we're only days into the attacks on Iran, Congress is nowhere to be found. John Nichols is executive editor with The Nation. He joins us now to talk to us about the duty that Congress has in all of this and why it needs to assert its power before it's too late. John, thank you so much for being here. Big fan of your work.
I appreciate that. That's very kind. I really respect what you're doing as well. And I'm certainly, I don't know if I could say I'm glad to talk about this topic because I've probably talked about it 1,000 times through many, many years, but it is a very important topic.
It is. If you wouldn't mind, we did have some really crucial elections yesterday, and I was hoping we could dig into that just briefly. So obviously all eyes were on the Texas U.S. Senate primary. We had on the Democratic side, James Tallarico defeated Jasmine Crockett. He will be the nominee. Things were a lot messier on the Republican side, where you will now have a runoff election against Attorney General Ken Paxton versus the incumbent John Cornyn. We now are going to have a hard-fought second round of a fight with Paxton and Cornyn. Millions of dollars are going to be spent, lots of attacks. MAGA has been really split in this race. John, do you think this is a good sign for Democrats with an unlikely but hopeful pickup opportunity?
Well, how gentle you are in using the term millions of dollars between now and May when the runoff election occurs. It will be tens of millions. This will be very possibly one of the most expensive elections in American history. It's certainly one of the most expensive runoff elections in American history because they're relatively rare. But Texas has that old model where if nobody gets 50%, you put the two top candidates against one another.
The Southern model.
Oh, yeah. It's something that the Reverend Jesse Jackson, whose memory we all are honoring this week, warned about and talked about a lot over the years. You know, obviously, this has deep roots going back to the segregation era when there was an effort to make sure that if you had a couple liberal candidates, even modestly liberal candidates in a primary, that at the end of the day, you could knock them out ultimately in a runoff election. And there's a lot of ugly political history associated with runoffs, but Texas maintains them. And in this case, your question is a very appropriate one because what happened on Tuesday in Texas was a Democratic primary that pitted two people who were actually very close to one another on the issues, right? Shared a lot of values. And but it was a tough race, and it was one where people had a hard time with it, figuring out whether they wanted to back Tallarico or Jasmine Crockett. And they really, a lot of folks in Texas, I talked to them, they wrestled with it, right? And people wondered, well, how's this all going to sort out? Well, it was a Tallarico victory and a very thoughtful, generous endorsement from Crockett. And so the Democrats are much more united, at least in the immediate aftermath of the primary, than I think some people had thought would happen. Right? There was always a concern that camps would go different directions or whatever. It's looking for the Democrats to be kind of on the same page. Now you move to the Republicans, and the Republicans had a three-way primary in which a third candidate got about 13-14% of the vote. End result was that they both finished about the same, roughly, low 40s, right? They go into this runoff, and it was already ugly before. It was at a level where you didn't want your children to watch the ads on the Republican side, and suddenly you've got the reality of another 2-month battle. that is going to be generous, I think, to the Democrats. And the reason for this is that the Cornyn and Paxton camps will tear at each other so intensely during this time. It really is, kind of a fight for, the soul of the party in many ways, because, while they're both very tied to Trump, and you shouldn't be unrealistic about it, the reality is that Cornyn is seen as kind of more mainstream, right? A little more Washington predictable, whereas Paxton has been, all in on the Trump side. The question that we're going to have is whether the president endorses. If the president does endorse, that's a big deal. It might sort some things out, and he might do that, for the purpose of trying to save a seat. And why I say that is we are now looking at a circumstance, because of what happened on Tuesday and because unity on the Democratic side, deep division on the Republican side, where a state that is relatively closely divided, more closely divided than I think some people have thought, Beto O'Rourke getting 48% back 6 years ago, or is it, 8 years ago. I hope I'm counting right. And other candidates running reasonably well. So now we're in this situation where if there isn't any kind of effort to get through this fight without tearing the party apart, Texas becomes a very possible battleground state in the fall. For the Democrats, that's a tough thing because Texas is an incredibly expensive state, and with multiple media markets, it's cost a lot of money to run there. But when you put that into play and you recognize in North Carolina, all the signals from yesterday are the Democrats are in very good position there to flip a seat. In Maine, you're starting to see polling that suggests that Democrats could very possibly flip a seat. You're looking at Sherrod Brown running a very credible campaign with decent numbers in Ohio. And then you're looking up in Alaska with Mary Peltola, who's launched a campaign up there that looks like it might, kind of cross lines of partisanship. And so you add all the pieces together and you have the prospect now that the Democrats have a couple of routes that might get them to a majority in the Senate. And one of those could potentially be Texas.
Yes. If Ken Paxton ends up being the nominee, who has been impeached by a Republican House of Representatives in Texas, and has a long history of corruption charges he's beaten so far, I'm wondering if he might actually be able to be more unlikable than Ted Cruz, which I'm not sure if that's possible.
I mean, you're setting a pretty high bar there. And it's an interesting thing. Ted Cruz is someone who we're going to find out, right? Did he was he the bottom, right? Is that as rough as it can be for a Republican in Texas? His numbers from 2018 were really bad. It suggested possibility there. But for a few lucky breaks, he might have been beaten. And yet Paxton, he has the combination of that likability factor that you're discussing, and also some really scorching scandals. And the interesting thing was that when Cornyn was asked about an incredibly rough ad that went into Paxton's personal life as well as his economic, everything, right? Incredibly rough ad. And they said, well, is that going a little far? And Cornyn, if I'm right in quoting this, his answer was, well, it's all true, and I can just see that clip from Cornyn, right? If Paxton were to become the nominee, becoming a part of the Democratic ads, right? Where, just say, who says that the criticisms of Paxton are correct? Senator Cornyn. It's all true. So, in politics, especially in a place like Texas, where politics gets pretty rough quite often, there is, you can already see the kind of through lines being developed here. But, we're going to have to watch this closely, and it'll be a big political fight. Although I will tell you, the way that our foreign policy and our domestic policy are headed in this country right now, I think we may live in a slightly different age where, I am old enough to remember when, a tough primary someplace could really, capture the news, right? It would be what we would watch for several days going in. We'd look for the national repercussions, everything like that. It may happen with Texas, but on the other hand, who knows what a mess things will be in other places, come a couple months from now.
Texas has been one of the states that has implemented some of the toughest voting restrictions in the country. And yesterday, the Texas Supreme Court actually stepped in and stopped some voting. And so now there's some confusion about how the votes will really be tallied in certain areas. What do you make of what happened there, John? And is this a possible preview of some of the shenanigans we may see in other primaries, particularly in red areas, or even, what the Trump administration may have in store for us in November?
Yeah, I think the application for primaries is less significant, frankly, than for November. And in the primary, when I say less significant, I'm not dismissive. I think it's a disaster always when people don't know where to go to vote, because government has not done the basic job of informing them and kind of putting the pieces in place to run a free and fair election. So it always matters in a primary as well. But obviously in a November election, if that were to happen, say in blue cities, right, and you just have a circumstance where a lot of polling places are moved, and this is the issue that people are talking about, is folks show up to vote, right, and they've always voted in a certain place. They're very comfortable with doing it. They know how to do it, and then suddenly your polling place has been moved, right, and then you got to figure out where you're supposed to go. It may involve more time. If you happen to not be driving or whatever, you may have to take other steps. It messes up the day, and it has an impact on voting, right? And so when you have a challenge like that, there's a very, not perfect, but easy solution. And that is you extend voting hours. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you the number of times, it's in the hundreds, where I've written, voting hours were extended in this this county or this precinct. And it used to be a pretty bipartisan concept, right? You just, of course, something went wrong, you get it right. There are historic examples of, machines going down in certain places. Polling, it always happens in Chicago. There's a polling place that's locked. I can't tell you the number of times I've reported on elections in Chicago where voters show up and nobody came to unlock, the people who are supposed to be working the polling place didn't show up, right? It's not just there, it's other places. But end result, you can do this, right? You can make the day right. And when you fail to do that, or when a court intervenes and says, oh, you can't extend the hours or something, that's a terrible, terrible precedent, if you will. And so now, I worry about all this. I worry a lot about November. I don't worry about canceled elections or anything like that. What I worry about is mangled elections, right? Elections where you could have any number of factors come into play that simply make it harder for people to vote. And you understand that you and I were political geeks, right? We're sitting here talking about primaries in states where we don't live, or I shouldn't assume on you. But we pay serious attention to it. The people that are listening will be folks who pay serious attention to these issues, to all this politics. A lot of people who are, super engaged and they care, they do maybe even look at the voter guide and stuff like that, but still voting is just a part of their busy day, right? And when you make it hard to vote, there is a practical challenge there that can impact turnout, it can impact results. And so we should, as a people, be very, very conscious of how this operates. And one of the, if I one walk away lesson here is that every place should have a model, and some states do it very well, should have a model for if polling places move, you get notification, and then there is advertising. You can do a number of things that just make it, get it into people's consciousness that you're going to have to vote in a different place. I understand that happens at times, but I can tell you, somebody who's really into politics and covers it a lot, pays a lot of attention to it. I have had my polling place move
right.
And I showed up at the wrong place, right? Now it happened that meant I had to walk 6 blocks another direction. But you understand what I'm saying? It's for a lot of folks, especially if you're a busy parent, something like that, you've got to go to another place becomes a burden and a challenge, and one that I think most people would still see through. But even if you lose a few folks along the way, that's not good for democracy.
If you're just joining us, I'm Susan Demas. I'm sitting down with the nation's John Nichols, and we just talked a little bit about some of the key elections yesterday. But now let's turn to Iran. We are now 4 days into this conflict, John. When you first heard that the war was real, President Trump had sent bombs to Iran, what was going through your mind?
Well, that I'm not a very good predictor of things, because I had thought that in the run-up to the war, in the later days of that week, when Oman had announced further negotiations, and there are a number of other factors that made me think, well, it's not going to happen this weekend, right? At least that certainly the U.S. had moved forces into the region. You were getting a lot of signals about people being told to leave certain places, and Americans in Israel, things like that, were being told, be prepared to evacuate and stuff. There were messages to embassy staff, things like that. And you read all those reports and you think, okay, well, these are the things that you do see before an attack, before a war. By the same token, I just felt that there was so much space in which to continue negotiations. There was evidence that the Iranians were actually putting some things on the table. And so with that put in place, it just struck me or I was inclined to believe that this wouldn't happen that fast, right? Not that it wouldn't happen, but it wouldn't come so quickly. And so, yes, it happened that I'm a pretty good sleeper, but I stirred up around 3 a.m. on Saturday morning. Mm-hmm. And of course, I did the thing you're never supposed to do, which is pull your phone over and open it up and look at what's going on. And there it was. There was Donald Trump with a big white hat, USA on it, making this announcement. And so, yes, what I thought at that moment was that this was coming faster than I expected. It suggested that diplomacy. It raised all sorts of questions about how seriously diplomacy was really being taken by the U.S. and a lot of other factors. And then, look, again, I've done this for long enough that I had, flashbacks, whatever the proper term is, to 1991 and to 2003. When you have this sort of shock and awe moment, you launch a war against a very large country with great complexity, right, within it, and it is about regime change, as that becomes very clear, but it's also about a lot of other factors. And look, these things don't usually go well. I can say that that's not a political statement, right? Mm-hmm. That is a statement rooted in history. It didn't go well for the Brits. It didn't, in their long colonial era. At least not necessarily, not always. It didn't go well for other countries. When the United States has launched in certainly recent decades these sorts of attacks, we've often ended up with forever wars. And so, yeah, I thought about all that.
Our so-called Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, actually referenced shock and awe this morning when he was giving an update of sorts. And I think we have that clip.
Thus far, Operation Epic Fury has delivered twice the air power of shock and awe of Iraq in 2003, minus Paul Bremer and the nation building. The campaign has 7 times the intensity of Israel's previous operations against Iran during the 12-day war. 7 times.
Pete Hegseth makes Donald Rumsfeld seem circumspect and someone who is, really considering all of the factors of diplomacy and the rules of engagement. Whenever I hear Pete Hegseth talk, it's just, it seems to be like he's still the weekend anchor on Fox and Friends, and he's just trying to give these cute sound bites. But as someone who would really like to hear specifically, how is the war going? We have already lost, a half a dozen U.S. service members. There are reports about our munitions being depleted. Our allies in the region are being bombed. I find when I'm listening to him that I feel like I'm less educated than I was when I started.
Well, that's often the case with this administration, and sometimes that's deliberate, and sometimes that's just incompetence, whatever term you want to use. Let's begin with a couple of basics. It is unbelievably tragic that we've lost a number of American lives and that others have been injured. It is concerning in any war effort, obviously, if you have munitions issues and things of that nature, what you've brought up. But then there is also the reality of what has happened on the ground in Iran. And we have images going out around the world of mass funerals for schoolgirls. Right. And, I respect the complexity of war. I understand that innocents can be killed in war. It happens. I respect also the fact that the U.S. was clearly targeting a lot of the leadership in Iran, and I understand those factors. Whether you agree or not is different, but understand that that's part of war, right? But the images out of Iran at this point are in some cases so horrific and so overwhelming, and they're going around the world, right? So that's a part of the war effort too, right? It's a part of what's happening as well. And what you want is a sober, sane, responsible message to come from those who are prosecuting the war, right? And that's Marco Rubio, it's Donald Trump, it's Hegseth, it's all of these folks. And to say in a moment like that, that we've dropped this disproportional number of bombs, we've done this disproportional amount of damage, minus the nation building, right? And you think to yourself, why was that a necessary phrase, right? At a time when even Donald Trump is saying that there is some kind of hope that something will come next, right? And then you say minus the nation building. Now, at its best, you can take that as saying, well, we're going to let them decide for themselves. But it seems when you say that it's like, we're going to just bomb this place at an incredible level. And then we're not going to make much effort to build it back up, right? We're not going to try. And why that is troublesome, why that ought to be troublesome for Americans, whether they support this effort or not, is that when you don't help places rebuild, if you really are, affirmatively against that, you create circumstances which are much more likely to see civil wars, internal battles, divisions, breaking up of countries, the whole thing. And there ought to be a sense of perspective in a moment like this. Mm-hmm. And there ought to be a consciousness of the messages that you send. And the messages that you send have an impact on the people on the ground. They also have an impact on people in other countries and the global coalitions that might be needed. So bottom line, not a very good statement there.
I know you recall, as I do, back in 2003, Colin Powell put forth the Pottery Barn Doctrine. You break it, you buy it. And as that turned out, that was a very costly perspective for the Bush administration to take with their war in Iraq. We were obviously there for years. We lost many service members. Tens of thousands, at least, Iraqis were killed in the process. And it made people of all political persuasions be very, very wary of future interventions in the Middle East. However, the I guess, Trump doctrine of we break it, it's your problem
Mm-hmm.
seems to be an even worse solution, because in power vacuums, oftentimes what emerges is something worse. And it was only a few weeks ago that Donald Trump was urging people to stand up against the Iranian regime, and thousands of people were killed as a result. Now, it doesn't seem like the administration is offering these people who are trying to fight for something better, they're not offering them anything, which seems to be incredibly tragic to me.
Tragic, but war is tragic.
Yes.
But so often. And I also think that it is ahistoric, right? It is antithetical to what we know about war in the broader sense, and in this region especially. And look, at the end of the day, the experience of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan war, the previous incursions and previous actions was to do two things. It made Americans war weary, right? We were tired of it, and war wary, right? We kind of thought, okay, maybe we shouldn't go into these things.
Right.
Where we're at right now is, I think the war weary reality lingers, but on the part of this administration, they kind of jettisoned the war wary part. And I think they did that without the American people. I think the American people are still war wary. They're still like, I'm not sure we really should be doing these things. That's what the polls say. And I think that here's a case where the people are often wiser than their leaders. And I think that they look at exactly what you're talking about, unintended consequences, long-term challenges, and they come to a conclusion that even when you deeply, deeply, passionately disagree with a government in another country, right, and really do feel that they're problematic on all sorts of levels, that doesn't necessarily mean that you launch a war. And this is a very American concept. John Quincy Adams, on July 4th, 1821, speaking to Congress, said, "America goes not abroad searching for monsters to destroy." Now, Adams at that point was the Secretary of State in James Monroe's administration. What he meant by that is that the United States was not going to look around the world and say, oh, wow, there's a horrible circumstance, we're going to go start a war there, or, we're going to try to get rid of that. And he said, Adams said, even if it is something that we really believe should happen, even if we, like the idea of removing a leader someplace, or we think, some shift should take place someplace, we ought not do it. And his argument for that was not one of, neglect for the world. He had been a diplomat. He had, at 15, he was serving as a diplomat. So, I mean, it's just kind of amazing what his international story was. What he was saying was that if the United States did that, right, we would involve ourselves in distant conflicts, which we could not get out of. And even if we told ourselves that we could, they would keep drawing us back. He also said that it would undermine liberty at home. We would become so committed to distant struggles that we would lose sight of basic responsibilities, both as regards freedom, and I would also argue as regards the organization of society, economics, and things of that nature. And so we, for a very long time, were war wary. We were cautious about these things. And to have an administration now that seems to be at times almost cavalier, ill thought, ill planned, poor messages, I think is something that Americans of different ideologies and politics can agree is problematic. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that Donald Trump, when he was running for president, recognized that. One of the things that made him the Republican nominee in 2016 was his willingness to call out the Bushes, the Bush family, right? And that was something that he then evolved out of the Republican process to a broader message as regards November elections with Democrats, who often had bad records on some of these things as well. And you ended up in a situation where Donald Trump in 2024, especially with a boost from J.D. Vance, was positioning himself as a peace candidate, right? A candidate wouldn't start wars. And I don't know if that was in his make up if it was in his head at that time or not. But what I can tell you is it was smart politics because it was speaking to Americans who really don't want these things.
Right. And that's why his about face in his second administration has been so striking. I mean, this is the 8th time that he has started a military operation, and he's only been back in power for a little over a year. What can we make of the fact that he seems so eager to get us embroiled in so many different conflicts? There's Venezuela. We just learned that there was a bombing in Ecuador. And obviously, Iran has the potential to be quite a quagmire. What do you make of this change in the second Trump administration?
I think we could psychoanalyze it all over the place. We can politically analyze it all over the place. We can bring all sorts of analyses to it. But let me suggest something that may not get mentioned as much, and that is, I especially as a young writer spent a lot of time in the United Kingdom, in Britain, and I saw the long-term kind of the aftermath of colonialism, right? Their impact. I also spent time in India, South Africa, other places that, all these global games that European countries played. You saw elements of it, around the world. And one of the things that I concluded was that when you embark on a career of empire, right, when you start using your military and economic power to have influence in places around the world, and you really make that a part of your vision, your agenda, it's hard to stop, right? You start to think, well, the easiest way to deal with this might be regime change, right? We'll pull somebody out of there, or we'll kill somebody, or we'll do something, and then somehow it'll all work out okay, right? And this is, of course, going back, Dick Cheney will be greeted as liberators in Iraq. And I only suggest that in a very, simple baseline model to say that I do think at times leaders kind of start to conclude that this is the quote unquote easy way to deal with a complex world, and that you have all this military power, you have all this economic power. Here's a way that you can get your will, right? And I do think in his second term, Donald Trump has looked at the world with frustration, doesn't do what he wants it to do. And he may be looking at the reality. I know he may say differently, that he doesn't have, he's not going to be president forever, right? And I know that people might disagree with me in saying that, but I think there's going to come a point where he is no longer president. He's looking at what he wants to achieve in the world, how he wants to do it. And so you end up in this situation where, when you do a few of these, they just sort of build on themselves. And, the United Kingdom ended up with a global empire that it couldn't possibly manage, and that it didn't, at a certain point, didn't even pay very good attention to. And true with some other European countries. In the United States, we always wanted to be different as a country. It was our goal, at our best, and we were not always at our best by any measure, but it was our goal to not be that empire builder, not be that colonial power, because we had come out of a revolt against a king and against empire. And I think that at this point we've entered into a period, and we have a cover story coming in the next issue of The Nation that's about this. It's about kind of that Trump's disorder, right? How he's not just unsettling things in the U.S., it's around the world. And what are the long-term playouts of this environmentally, politically, in so many other ways? What are the playouts for human beings in places all over the world and in the United States? And I do think it's worthy to pause at a moment like this, as crazy as everything is, and ask ourselves, whether we are moving to a place moving onto a track, if you will, that could have really bad repercussions over the next few years. Because if the United States' answer to a diplomatic challenge, right, or to a complexity with a country, a place that we really disagree with, we really don't like the leadership, we're really concerned genuinely concerned about what's happening in some place. If our answer is, well, maybe we'll sit down at a table for a little while, and if we don't get what we want, we're just gonna, we're gonna start bombing, or send troops in or do whatever. That moves the United States into I think, a dangerous space, and also a deeply costly one. There's the cost of lives, and that's the first thing we care about. But also, we're hearing right now that the administration is talking about coming to Congress to ask for a massive amount of additional money.
Right.
And you're sort of, we have the most amply funded military in the world in history. And now there's more money that's got to go there at a time where we have in recent months had debates about whether we can maintain food programs for hungry kids.
And we've cut the subsidies for healthcare under the ACA.
Yeah.
That was never restored. And we're told there was no money for that, but apparently there's always money for endless wars. John, that's such a fascinating point to me about this bend that Trump has to try and dominate the world. And I think we see that with his economic policy, his tariff policy, which the Supreme Court said was illegal. That was all about economic domination, trying to make other countries bend to our will to pay what Donald Trump felt was owed to our country and really to him. But I want to talk about another part of our government that seems to have been completely absent here, and that is Congress.
Yep.
Obviously, we have Republicans in charge of both the Senate and the House. Mike Johnson and John Thune have both happily abdicated their responsibility to the president. But you wrote earlier this week in The Nation about a bipartisan effort in the House for Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, who, of course, teamed up on the Epstein Files Act. They're trying to push a debate about the war in the House. Tim Kaine is trying to do the same in the Senate. Talk to us about what the likelihood is of seeing some sort of movement in either chamber.
At the risk of going all historical on you, I'm going to tell you, our Congress has for now about 85 years been a disaster as regards the basics of constitutional due diligence. And the last time where we had a clearly declared war was in December of 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt, after Pearl Harbor, went to Congress. And this is a pretty big deal, right? It's a global war already going on. The United States is being drawn very rapidly into it. We've had a very horrific attack on Pearl Harbor. And Roosevelt still said, hey, we got to get the Congress together. Everybody's got to come in. And I'm going to ask for a declaration of war. In fact, actually a series of declarations of war involving both the Pacific and Europe. And Congress, did its duty, right? They did issue those declarations of war. And with them, Franklin Roosevelt went beyond the immediate response, right? And yeah, if Pearl Harbor gets bombed, you are going to try and protect it, right? You're going to use whatever forces and to protect it there. But he recognized or believed he needed, under our Constitution, a declaration of war so that he could, move into a broader conflict. And they did. Since then, we haven't declared wars. The closest we've gotten is an occasional authorization of the use of military force, ill-defined, often used not for just one conflict, but multiple conflicts, kind of becoming elastic in what it even means. And even there, an authorization of the use of force comes before you get to that point of deciding you're going to do it. It just basically says you've got this option, right, of using force. And again, I would interpret it meaning you still have to come back and ask for the actual declaration of war. You may prepare and stuff like that, but this, there's a clear constitutional requirement. It is in, that essential first part of the Constitution where you lay out what the Congress, which should be, the kind of the check and balance on the executive, a defining role. And you say, well, we're putting that aside. And we put it aside now for so long that 50 years ago, members of Congress were like wrestling with the question of Vietnam. And
Right.
so they said, oh, well, we'll create something new, the War Powers Act. And wise people, and I've written about those debates back in the 70s, wise people at the time said, why? Why don't we just stick to the core concepts of the Constitution? The argument was, well, we're in a new era, right? That an era, Constitution was written before airplanes, before, transcontinental missiles and, all sorts of things. And so, all the threats that go with that, we need to have a better definition of it. And so the War Powers Act debates back in the 70s were intense debates. And they said, how are we going to exactly define it? Because at that time, Congress still thought, well, we shouldn't give up too much of our authority here. And so they created that term imminent threat, right? They said, you either have to have been attacked or you see that attack coming, like it's immediate. And then a president can take actions, has to notify Congress, has to be under the oversight of Congress. We've blown that apart again and again and again. And so where we're at now is a situation where if we had a constitutional muscle, it has been allowed to atrophy. It's become so weak and so ineffectual that you're almost rebuilding the plane as you're flying, right? And that's a pretty terrible metaphor, but I think somehow it communicates that it's hard to do. And so when you ask me if Congress is going to check and balance Donald Trump on this war, I'm going to say that's really difficult. It's going to be a really challenging moment to get Congress to actually do what it ought to do, which is, obviously support the War Powers Act resolutions in the House and the Senate. In and of itself, that's difficult. You have Republican leadership, Republican majorities. The majorities are so close, especially in the House, where you've got possibilities. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your politics, both parties are a little divided, right? You got some Democrats who will go against the resolution, probably. You have some Republicans who will go for it. How many becomes a big deal in the House because the margin is so close. In the Senate, it's a little more complex, but again, possibilities. These are both bipartisan resolutions. And that means that you've got at least that zone in which you can talk about moving beyond the kind of stark power games of the House and Senate. The challenge, of course, is that first and foremost, Donald Trump can veto a resolution or reject a resolution. It's not a lot of power here in and of itself, but I think it's incredibly important. And I think what Khanna and Massey and Kane and a number of other members, more than I've usually seen at this point, once the bombs have begun to fly, this level of opposition that we're seeing is quite significant. I think it does reflect where the people are. If they can get to a point where these resolutions are taken seriously, really debated, and ultimately, if they could pass them, and we'll see in hours, in days, what happens there, then you begin a process by which a couple things happen. One, a reassertion of Congress's role, and that's no small thing. Given that history, right? This is important in such a moment as this. It also, I think, crystallizes opposition, and, not just in Washington, but around the country. People see that there really is a place to go on this, that there is a theory of saying, yes, we could stop this. And then I think you'll also see court wrangling, as we have around these issues in the past, very often. And, does it bring an immediate solution? Probably not. Does it open up the possibility that we might begin to rebalance this country as regards constitutional requirements and as regards matters of war and peace? I live in hope.
Before we let you go, John, you have written some scathing pieces about DHS Secretary Kristi Noem in the wake of ISIS occupation in Minneapolis. You've called for her impeachment. How would you assess her testimony yesterday on the Hill?
Well, it was smoother than Pam Bondi's.
That's a low bar, but I'm sure she'll take it.
Give it the due. I don't know. It's never a good situation where they're literally talking about you shooting dogs.
No, and that came from a Republican senator, Tom Tillis.
Yeah, and Tillis also a very, very deeply skeptical line of questioning. He said, I want things from you. If you don't get them, I'm going to, come back at this. And it's an interesting thing. Tom Tillis is he's kind of unbound because he's not running for re-election.
Right.
But it was striking. You also saw some other Republicans asking tougher questions about DHS funding, advertising, things like that, which was, there was something akin on the part of the senators there to a almost traditional oversight hearing, right? Mm-hmm. That you had people not just going directly into their camp, but there was some questioning. I think that is a reflection of the fact that there are many, many Republicans who think that Noem is not handling this job well, right? Mm-hmm. That even if they agree on immigration, even if they agree with the president on some of these issues, that the way that the DHS has operated is disastrous. And Tillis has said that. Murkowski and some others have said it. Others have kind of hinted at it. You have a lot of Democrats who've asked tough, smart questions. I don't think that Noem offered much in the way of satisfaction as regards her answers. I didn't expect that. But I did think that I gave Chris Coons credit because he followed up on, and others asked these too. I think Alex Padilla did as well. They asked some tough questions about the use of ICE in relation to elections. And I think this is one of the areas that's very important to explore, because you have a president who's obviously very, very interested in the November elections. You have and talking about taking over elections in certain states. You have longtime associates of that president, people who are saying, well, ICE, in the case of Bannon, ICE could be sent to polling places, and things like that. And so you have a dialogue here around this that demands answers to questions. And Noem's answers to those questions were vague. They're like, well, we're not planning on anything like that. And so, and I gave a couple of senators credit for following up and saying, you say you're not planning on it. Does that mean you won't do it? And at a deeper level, I would have liked to have seen even more of an exploration of these questions. Because having been in Minneapolis and seen what had happened on the ground there, where the specific place where you put an ICE surge is less significant than the surge itself. The impact on the overall city, it creates fear, it creates tension, anxiety. Minneapolis is still wrestling with that, and I think that this is a legitimate topic to explore, simply to ask, is there going to be a situation? Are you going to have surges in October in particular cities and in particular parts of the country? If Secretary Noem says, absolutely not, we won't do that, we recognize that could be, a very bad way to operate, then okay, that'd be a pretty good message. On the other hand, if you get vague answers, I would argue, have another hearing, keep digging deeper, call more people. I relish the notion that the Congress of the United States might become a fully functional body, right? That it might actually do what it's supposed to do, which is oversight, budget oversight especially, and challenges to the executive, right? Pushing against it and demanding answers, and ultimately creating a system of checks and balances where we, the people, have some sense that decisions will be made in consultation rather than simply, by the whim of a man or the whim of some department head. And I know that's a romantic notion in this era, but I don't give up on it. And I'm very impressed with what Thomas Massie has said and done as regards these issues. I've been quite impressed with, especially the 60 Minutes interview with Rand Paul on some of these issues. And so I think we have to get beyond just rank partisanship, right? And even ideology, and recognize that there are touchstones in the Constitution that allow us to have dissent, that allow us to have debate, and that allow us to have a peaceful discourse, right? Where we may not be on the same page, we may really disagree, but we can sort things out, at least to a point where we get to the next election and we can debate our ideas, debate our differences. This is something we ought to aspire to as a country, and it's something we're very far from right now. But I take whatever good sign I can get, and I saw a couple of them in the hearing the other day.
John, thank you so much for taking so much time to speak with us. And please check out John's latest writing on the Iran war and Congress's role, as well as his many other wonderful pieces at The Nation. John, I hope you'll come back and talk with us again.
It's an honor to be with you. I appreciate the thoughtful conversation. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you.